Good afternoon, guys, and welcome to the second video in my coilover series. So today we're going to be talking about additional dimensions for the spring itself, such as the ID. And we just got done building these BC coilovers for my buddy, and then he ended up getting the 5.5 inch 326 power 100K springs, just like me, except obviously they're a different color. The Japanese way of saying 326 power is Mitsuru power. So the first question is, what is spring ID? ID stands for inner diameter. So if we come over to our chart over here, we got a nice little note there that says ID, inner diameter. Now this is going to be important to find out what springs are compatible for the spring purchase on your coilover, so that you can make sure that the springs you're buying, or if you're swapping springs, can actually fit your coilover. So we already know I like Broadway static. I like BC coilovers. Now let's go over the different spring IDs that both of these companies run. Broadway static runs a standard spring inner diameter of 60, which means the inner diameter of the spring is 60 millimeters. For whatever reason, BC likes to run an inner diameter of 62 millimeters, but I'm going to show you how they run that different inner spring diameter. So this is a standard spring perch of 60 millimeters. This is the same dimension spring perch that the BC coilover uses right there. However, when Broadway uses these spring perches, they use this spring isolator that is flat to keep the inner diameter at 60 millimeters. So the spring isolator is basically just this nylon or plastic washer. This acts as a buffer between the metal on the spring perch and the metal on the spring, so that you just don't have those two metal surfaces grinding against each other and binding. But BC uses this different spring isolator that actually has this raised edge to it, which actually adapts the 60 millimeter spring perch into a 62 millimeter spring perch, because it adds a millimeter on either side, which increases the inner diameter to 62 millimeters. So this information comes in handy whether you own either set of these coilovers. If you have the BCs, you already know that you'll have this setup. So if you're going to buy a standard spring inner diameter of 60 millimeters, you'll want to swap to a spring isolator kind of like this that's flat, so that it doesn't affect the inner diameter of the perch itself. If you have a Broadway static and you're going to size up to 62 or 63 millimeters, then you know that you can use this to keep the spring seated better in place. However, if the spring diameter is slightly bigger than 60 millimeters itself, you can be perfectly fine using this one. You'll just have a few millimeters of slop within the perch, which I say is negligible. Just keep in mind that you can always size up on these spring perches, but you cannot size down. So this is a 60 millimeter. If we want to do an ID 58 or something weird like that, that spring literally would not fit within this perch. So you wouldn't be able to do it unless you did something like throw this perch on a lathe and actually file down some of this material on the inner diameter of the perch. So going back to our chart over here, we have ID 60, standard spring inner diameter, 62 BC. Now, if you buy springs from 326 power, the smallest inner diameter that you can get is 63. Now, as far as I can tell, there are not any ID 63 adapters made. I could be wrong. However, what I'm doing is actually sizing these 60s up to the 62 using this BC spring isolator, and therefore I'm only going to have about a millimeter of slop within this perch itself. So that's like super negligible, only 1 millimeter of slop. And if you do want to get 326 power springs for whatever reason, please make sure they're above 50K, because Swift now goes up to 50K, so you can buy a standard Swift spring up to 50K. If you want to go higher than 50K, then you can look at an option like 326 power. But honestly, these 100Ks are pretty crazy. I know a normal person wouldn't want to run them. A lot of people say that I'm stupid for running them, but whatever. These are basically just the clout springs. The 100K do go crazy though. Now, lastly, another reason why I harp on Broadway Static and BC so much is that they use pretty predictable and standard spring sizes, coilover dimensions, etc. Now, if you're using a weird brand like TN or I wrote here other garbage ass coilovers, but they use super weird spring IDs like 65 and 70. Honestly, finding springs with that ID is going to be a lot harder. It makes these coilovers a lot less compatible with other applications. So that's why I kind of just don't recommend them at all. Plus, they don't go low enough. And please don't forget that Fortunato is a sister company of Broadway Static. Alright, so the last thing I want to go over is spring height in millimeters. Now, when you're buying these springs, you got ID blah blah blah, and then you'll probably see an H here, or like for example H140. So people are like, oh, what does H140 mean? So it's basically just the height in millimeters. Now all you gotta do is go into Google and type in blah 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 millimeters to inches, and then you can get a nice standard measurement that you can relate to. So if you type in 140 millimeters in Google, you'll find out that it is 5.5 inches. So please don't be dumb in that aspect. You shouldn't have to ask somebody what the conversion is for whatever dimension you're looking at, because Google does conversions super easily now. So just search it up, figure out what you need to do. And yeah, I just got another note in here that says a few millimeters of slop within the spring inner diameter and the spring perch is negligible. Okay, I lied. I'm gonna go over one more thing. So the thread pattern on this strut body is the same between Broadway Static and BC. So what you can actually do is buy replacement parts for either coilover, and they'll actually fit and thread onto the opposing company. So as some of you may know from my slotting video, I actually have BC Racing lower mounts on this coilover just because they slot further than the Broadway ones, and I had no problem threading those on to these strut bodies, even though these are Broadway coils. And don't forget, you're a moron if you run 100K springs.